Well, colleagues, thank you so very much. It's just a terrific privilege to be here, to be able to facilitate and engage in this discussion with Eric Schmidt, who I know everyone's been looking forward to this session. I do, before we get into that discussion, just want to thank everyone who's attended on behalf of my department, the Department of Home Affairs, which works very closely with our conference organisers, ASPI, and we really just and value the partnership that we have with ASPI. There could be no more important topic in the strategic area of thinking and policy at the moment than the crossovers between technology and security, and what a splendid program ASPI has put together. Thank you so much for the Sydney Dialogue. You heard earlier from the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, the Defence Minister. You'll hear later today from my boss, the Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity, Claire O'Neill, who will be giving a virtual speech later on today, and I know, having read that there'll be a lot of interest in what she's got to say about Australia's approach to cybersecurity particularly. But if I can just commence by some opening framing remarks. I'm sure everyone in this audience would be very well aware of Eric Schmidt's work, particularly in recent times, after he set up Schmidt Futures in 2017, having left an illustrious Silicon Valley career, of course, preeminently as the CEO of Google for so many years, from 2001 to 2011, and in more recent years has partnered in a really interesting way with practitioners and experts from other fields, including most notably Dr. Kissinger, with whom he's worked closely in recent years, especially on the issue of artificial intelligence. Eric's also worked with former Deputy Secretary of Defence, Bob Work, and has written some really interesting co-authored as well as singularly authored publications on the crossover between technology and security. In order to get the most value out of this discussion, I thought I would just lead with some key points and perhaps posit some questions to Eric that he might want to respond to, and that will be a way for us to get a discussion going. Now, I can see that we've got Eric identified as being online, and Eric, I certainly hope that you can hear me, because otherwise I'll be speaking into a technology void. There you are. Eric, it's great to see you there, come up on our screen. Welcome, Eric Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Good morning in Sydney. I cannot wait to return to Australia, a country which I totally love, now that COVID is largely over.
So, Eric, before I get into the discussion, and particularly ask you to draw out some of your more recent thinking and writing, particularly around innovation power, and of course you've currently got a very important Foreign Affairs article in the current edition on innovation power, and late last year you did some work with Bob Work on a related issue of the Offset X strategy, and I'd like to ask you about both of those. But just before we get into the discussion proper, perhaps just a personal reflection. You've spent a lot of time in technology. You're a tech entrepreneur. You're globally famous. At what point in that intellectual and personal journey did you start to think about these security issues, which have so been focused on in most recent years, including through your collaboration with Dr. Kissinger, the book you wrote on AI, and the other work that I've mentioned? Just a few personal reflections about how you started to think about the crossover between technology and security issues.
Well, thank you for that. Like everybody else in tech, I was obsessed with myself and what tech could do, and I thought we would take over the world. And I think my first comeuppance was when we bought YouTube, and understanding that the world did not work quite the way we thought it was going to work. A few years later, Ash Carter, who was the Secretary of Defense and unfortunately just passed away of a heart attack, asked me to serve as a consultant to the US military, which I thought was curious because I've never been a military person. But I became very interested in national security and what technology was going to do. That led me to work on both the AI aspects of national security, but also what, in my view, is wrong with innovation, which ultimately led me to view that there's a difference between hard power and soft power and innovation power. And I fundamentally believe that the future will be driven by innovation and not by hard power and soft power. So I guess I've ended up as a uniquely different point of view than I thought I would start out, that I would end up with.
Well, the blending of perspectives, I think itself creates new possibilities and new ways of seeing things. Your very deep expertise in tech, as I think you just said, you never came up as a security guy or a military guy, I think was your reference, but the fact that a late Secretary Carter tapped you on the shoulder to come on to that Pentagon process, I think was speaks volume to the late Secretary's own vision and innovation. He was known as an innovator in that space, perhaps as those who knew him even indirectly well, perhaps didn't think that he achieved the kind of breakthroughs in procurement and acquisition and innovation reform in the US Defence Department that perhaps he set out to achieve, but he left an enduring mark, and we all remember him very, very fondly. Eric, if I can return the favour just very briefly before we speak about innovation power, just to reflect on my own journey, it's diametrically the opposite. When I came into government service 36 years ago, and I know that if you can see me, you'll say that can't possibly be right because you couldn't possibly be that old. Thank you, Eric. The most I could tell my mother about the work that I was doing in the defence intelligence community was to refer her to the Hunt for Red October and say that this technology that the Soviet Navy was demonstrating, as Sean Connery famously said, "Tonight we sail into history," was about the most I could say. And what strikes me about that period as a young intelligence analyst was that technology was all within government. It was very government-centric. The thought that there were technology companies who could give us capabilities that were not available otherwise to military intelligence and security services was baffling to us. And indeed, in that late competition in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, one of the key factors, of course, that led to the breaking of the Soviet Union was that they couldn't keep up with the dynamism and the innovation of the US economy, which was sitting off to one side, producing great consumer outcomes and great benefits for its society. And then the military was able to actually develop technology in its own ecosystem, for instance, to hunt for Soviet submarines, dare I say it. That paradigm over the 36 years that I've been in this business has completely flipped. And indeed, most of the technologies that you speak about in some of your recent writings, such as swarm drones or the ability to upload sensitive government data into secure cloud so that if your physical ministries are attacked, for instance, you've got a resilient backup of your data, all of that's been generated out of the private sector. So if I can then take you to that Foreign Affairs article which is currently in circulation, the March-April edition, you speak about innovation power. You just touched on that in your opening remarks. For the benefit of those very few in the audience who would not have read your article, I thought one of the most interesting insights that came out at me was your reference to, as human innovation traditionally has occurred, it hasn't, in a sense, catalysed further information in and of itself. You've got a memorable line in the article about faster planes never begat even faster planes. That was a whole new step change in plane technology. Whereas things like AI, particularly generative AI, and one day perhaps AGI, will itself generate not only its own advances, but will establish advances or power advances in other like fields. Can you draw out some of the further thoughts that you've put into that article on innovation power?
Well, a simple model for everybody is hard power. We understand that's military strength. You know, we're in charge, you're not, kind of thing. Soft power, of course, is economic power, cultural power, Hollywood, values, Western values, all that kind of stuff. We all understand this. The difference now is that we're locked in a battle with China that will define the future for the rest of our lives. And China is not like the Soviet Union. At its height, the Soviet Union was only a third of the scale of the United States. And although they were certainly dangerous, and they're dangerous now, they were not fundamentally a global platform competitor that could affect the West. But instead, now we have a autarkic, if you will, autocratic competitor that is run by technocrats that is very capable of inventing a new future. And they can invent a new communications future that's called Huawei and 5G, which is also known as a signals intelligence nightmare. They can invent a new application known as TikTok, which has taken over all the teenagers in the world. Now, I am perfectly happy that somebody knows where our teenagers are, because the average family doesn't, and the Chinese clearly do. But the principle of China being able to do first communications and second apps is something that if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said not. They're on their way to dominating new energy, that is the infrastructure of electronic vehicles. They're already ahead in things like surveillance and in financial services. What's next? So we need to get our act together. And it's just better to have a competitor. So here we have these great people in Australia, great people in the UK, great in the US, doing AUKUS. What have you done for me lately? What are you doing to make sure we stay ahead of what the Chinese are doing. And that's true in AI, it's true in quantum, it's true in material science, it's true in synthetic biology, it's true in various forms of transportation and so forth. Now, I'm going to argue that the way the world works is there are these platforms, and the platforms become global platforms, and I want the platforms to be built in the West, right? I want them to reflect Western values. Can you imagine if the internet had been built using Chinese principles? Everything would be surveillance all day. That's clearly not good. So one final comment is that I went to Ukraine because I was interested in what happens when the tech people actually work with the military. And to see the way in which tech people would solve the problems of communications and targeting and surveillance and so forth using drones and many other navigational things is remarkable. And they do it at 1/50th of the cost of the military systems in the West. I'm so glad we're at peace. I'm so glad we can waste all this money on really big things when we should be building a large number of little things that work together. And that transition is the transition that all of us, Australia included, have got to get through. And you've got to get through it quicker than we are, in my view.
So, Eric, you've defined the problem statement very eloquently, and I just want to draw a number of those features out in a moment. But and then come back to some thoughts that you've developed in recent years around the prescriptions for government, including through the work you did on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and the work that you're sponsoring and chairing on special competitive strategies, of course, which really speak to the issues that you've been focused on in recent years. But before we come off the problem statement, and you touched on it at the very end, and it's very much a feature of not just your Foreign Affairs article, but other writings as well, and you touched on it at the very end of your remarks there about Ukraine, is our speed to decision, our speed to innovate, and our speed to adapt needs to be completely deconstructed. The way in which Western military intelligence, we just had a great panel just before you came on of very seasoned intelligence practitioners reflecting on this very same problem, and no doubt it will come up over the course of today's proceedings and tomorrow. The proceedings. You came out of Silicon Valley. That was built on disruption. It was built on disrupting your competitor, coming up with something that had an edge, coming up with something that no one had thought of before. Bureaucracies, and I touched on this in terms of my own time as a government official for 36 years, very much have got the opposite DNA. Set procedure, predictability, the management of risk, so as to account for the expenditure of public dollars. How do we bring these two different perspectives together? Because on the one hand, obviously, our democracies are reliant on the rule of law and the separation of powers and the oversight of officials such as me in terms of expending hard taxpayer $1. How do you introduce, in your experience, you did some work on the Defence Innovation Board, for instance, how do you start to break down that mentality to still keep our fundamental democratic oversight principles and our democratic accountability principles in place? But how do you start to change the thinking in public bureaucracies such as the one that I've served in for 36 years?
So thank you for that. And I think, in the first place, the people in all the positions are trying to do their best. The problem is that they have the wrong formulation of how to win. So I'll give you an example. From a technological perspective, in terms of military achievements, there's no place to hide anymore. Everybody has various forms of commercial and military satellites. You can't hide your aircraft carrier anymore. You cannot hire your big launcher thing. If you look at the HIMARS, for example, in Ukraine, they're very interesting because there's a tree, you park it under the tree, nobody can see it, then you move it, you shoot it, and then you move it somewhere else and you park it under a tree again. So we have a wrong conception of military power in that things will be quick, decentralized, very fast moving, hide in and out. That breaks almost every military doctrine, starting with aircraft carriers, and you can go on from there. And yet we still build them. Now, I happen to love aircraft carriers because I like big ships and they're great fun to visit, and I've enjoyed them. But the $18 billion that the latest carrier costs could be spent, think of the number of drones that you could build. And so what happens is that the bureaucracy, because it gets captured by the contractors and by the dominant thinking of the time, does not actually ask the question, will it work? There are many, many examples on the U.S. side of total failure. A good example is the LCS, which is the Littoral Combat Ship, which was designed to fight battles near the sea, near the beach. And the conception did not take for advantage that there would be missiles that could knock it out close to the ocean, close to the beach. It's just an error. So the way you solve these problems is you have a rule that you have a choice A and a choice B, and they're different, and you compete them against each other. And so a simple proposal for Australia is take some of the ideas that I've been working on in Offset X and try them in little groups and just say, do they work? Right? So for example, Australia is surrounded by water, as we all know, and your battleground, if you will, is the Pacific. Where are your underwater drones? That is the militarized underwater drones. How good are they? How far are they? Let's run that and compete that against the next big ship you're doing, right? And have an honest competition, because I can assure you that that drone is a lot cheaper than another example. In America, there is a discussion about the next generation fighter. Now, it's obvious to people like me, and I'm a private jet pilot as well, that the next version of these fighters should be automated. That is, it should be a drone, right? Because we can do that better, and there's all sorts of reasons. And yet the military says we have to have a pilot in the air as well as some drones. Okay, well, let's compete that. Let's have the pure drone one, right, against the military one. And by the way, the one involving humans is going to cost 10 times more because humans are important and we don't want to lose them and so forth and so on. So the only way I think that we can, just to be very blunt, that we can break this logjam is by hard competition of approaches. And instead what happens, in my experience with the US military, is that they set up really false tests. My best example is missile defense, which doesn't work very well. What we do is once a year, we arrange for a target to be shot up and another target very carefully to be shot so that it hits each other. Well, that's a great way to prove that the thing can hit each other once a year if we know where it is, which is precisely not how missiles work. So let's have a real competition and look for some new choices. And I think they're there. And the key thing I will tell you is that there are plenty of citizens in the Western countries who want to work in companies to serve the nation as civilians, to make money, and to make our national security greater. There's plenty of people who want to help.
I was going to come back to talent, and you've given me a perfect segue at the very end of your remarks there. I do want to leave, as requested by the organisers, a good 7 or 8 minutes at the end, Eric, for us to field questions from the audience. But before I do that, just to pick up a couple of points, you touched on and used the phrase Offset X, which is something that you have been working on, and you co-authored a piece with Bob Walk just before Christmas in the Atlantic, and there have been other writings that you've been where you've been using that phrase. Of course, that builds on the previous offset strategies in the 50s and 60s, where we talked about that highly militarised competition between the Soviet Union and the US. A refresh of the offset strategy in the 1970s to thwart a massive Soviet ground attack into Western Europe that would otherwise threaten to go tactically nuclear very quickly. Bob Work, when he was at the Pentagon under Ash Carter, of course, introduced the third offset. Can you just spend a moment or two just unpacking your idea of Offset X?
So the current situation in military strategy is high precision. And that's what the third offset really means. And precision is important because none of us want collateral damage. That's obviously bad. We don't want to harm anyone who's not a combatant. And we want to deliver our weapon or our defensive system precisely. That's what the third offset is. What we argue in Offset X is that there's another level of networked, autonomous approaches and you want to think about swarms, and you want to think about autonomy, you want to think about the use of AI, and you want to do it systematically. This concept, I'll give you another example. I have no courage at all. I have great admiration for our military people because they actually have real courage. I have zero. But if I found myself in a tank or as a soldier, I want 50 drones ahead of me and 50 drones behind me. The 50 in front of me, ready to attack and watching out for me, and the ones in the rear making sure that I'm not approached by the rear. Now today, we have one drone for every 2,000 soldiers. I want 50 right? So it's an inverted way of thinking about it, that we want a very small number of humans who are very heavily protected, who have extremely autonomous systems that are under their control in the battlefield. It's almost impossible to win against an autonomous, decentralized, human-controlled network of the kind that I'm describing. You just can't make enough progress. You can't shoot enough satellites down because there's more. You can't shoot enough drones down because there's more, and so forth. And if you look in Ukraine, right now they're having sort of a World War I type battle. If you look at the lines between, essentially below Bakhmut, near Zaporizhzhia and so forth, on there to Crimea, and I went there to investigate, by the way, so I know a little bit about it, and these people are incredibly courageous. They're locked in the World War I style battle, tanks on one side, tanks on the other. The only solution for that is going to be drones that go up, over, and around and from the rear, which the Russians can't defend against. So here we have a real life example of how you're going to win. And I want Ukraine to win for all the obvious reasons. And I think what happens in the military is because we're not, thank God, we're not at a real war in most of these countries. They're not really doing authentic exercises. So to me, the way you would do this is you would say, I have an asymmetric competitor who's coming up against Australia in the Pacific. That asymmetric competitor is using all these new tools. How am I going to defend myself? First, are my bases defended from drones, right? How do I hide my big assets from the satellites from my competitor or my enemy? These are questions that I would encourage you and the leadership of the country to have a hard reckoning of. And what's nice about Australia and the UK, by the way, is that because you're, just being blunt, smaller, you also have better control over things. Whereas the US military can be understood as a large country of different fiefdoms, which has many different bosses and many different incentive systems, including jobs programs and continuity programs and state funding programs and so forth. I hope, and I don't think that Australia has that problem. Eric, you could make progress. You could show the U.S. In fact, you could show the U.S. how to win.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you for that insight, wrapping together quite a few of your themes. Our topic, of course, is the Geo-Strategic technology competition and why it matters. I'm going to ask you two final questions to draw out two different aspects of your themes, and then I gather we've got questions from the floor. Is that right, Nina?
If you'd like to ask a question, just head down to the microphones.
So we'll start to warn out anyone who wants to ask Eric or indeed myself a question. Please start to move down to the front of the auditorium. We've got about 7 more minutes. Eric, can I ask two questions, or maybe it's the same question in two parts? One is an affirming question that speaks to one of the issues that I think you've been implying, which is talent and the innovation. There's something in the spirit of democracies that seems to me to be a natural advantage. If you could speak on that. Some of your writings speak to visa programs, what we're doing in our universities, the entrepreneurship and the innovation that's almost embedded in, if you like, capitalist free thinking societies. And then I'd like to ask you a provocation as a devil's advocate about a contrary view that I would want to put that goes to whether the world should in fact be on the path to decoupling. But if you can just address the talent issue first, and then I want to ask you about decoupling.
I don't understand where all of this sort of foreign opposition comes from within these countries. Don't you want the top people in the world, in Australia and in the US and in the UK, working for the national goals of those countries, right? Why would you not want the smartest Indians and Russians and Chinese out of those countries and in your country, right? It's obvious if you think about it, right? Because these are uniquely talented people. And yet in America, we have a situation where we take people, train them to the teeth in quantum, and then we kick them out and they go to China and they create a quantum program which is going to be used to decrypt and basically analyze all of our data when quantum finally works. It's insane, right? So I want our countries to, and if you talk to smart people around the world, they want to work with us. They want to work in your country or mine. Why? They're nicer countries. They're better run. They're better places. They have higher quality of living. Their kids are happier and so forth and so on. This is our advantage, and yet we are squandering it. It's insane. Now, the Chinese should be taken very seriously because their model, which is a different kind of model, is effective. So what advantages do we have? We have the same weather. They have more cash, right? They have certainly as large a diaspora as we do in terms of English, but we have open and free immigration, and people want to come to our countries and not to China.
Thank you, Eric. My concluding question is a deliberate provocation. You shouldn't assume that the premise of the question is one with which I agree. But what would you say to those who say, hang on, if you go down that path, the path that Eric Schmidt is promoting and representing in his writings and his thinking, you actually entrench a decoupling or a separation at a global level, at a strategic level of effectively two systems, a Western US-led system and the Chinese system. Indeed, in one of your articles, you talk about a clash of systems, not just a clash of states. What do you say to those who would say that your prognosis, whether it's right or not, the prescription of it actually entrenches separation and entrenches, if you like, decoupling to the detriment of global humanity?
I had hoped my argument was wrong. And when I started working on this, I actually hoped that you could get a group in China and a group in America, just using it as a simple model, to agree on common platforms around important things. In each of the platforms that I studied, for one reason or another, they got split. They got split for tariff reasons. They got split for signals intelligence reasons. They got split for political reasons. So there's just no scenario, in my view, where the really sexy stuff, so the strategically powerful platforms, are going to be common. It's not going to happen. There's too much danger to each country. And by the way, the Chinese don't want it any more than we want it. They don't want what they view as democratic core values in their country, right? We want, but they don't. So neither side wants to make the marriage work. So I think a reasonable model is the following. I think we're not decoupling in the sense that most people use it. We're going to have a great deal of non-strategic partnering with China, and Australia will in particular. There'll be lots of trade in things that are relatively commodity, steel, oil, minerals. Australia's rich with everything. There's going to be lots of that. But there's not going to be agreement on common standards about chips, common standards about operating systems, common standards about how the internet works. The systems it's just not going to happen. And the result is, unfortunately, we're going to see roughly a China world, a Western world. And the key question is not, will that happen? Because I'm quite sure. But what happens for the countries that are trying to be both? If you think about it, to be obnoxious, Germany wanted the market of China and the security of the United States. And now they've lost the market of China because they wanted the energy of China, and they can't get it anymore because of this horrific war. So it's really tough for the countries that are not obviously in one alignment. I am predicting that India will become more and more Western. It's traditionally non-aligned. I can't tell about the Arab countries. I think they're playing both sides pretty well right now. Russia and Belarus will clearly be rogue actors for the next 20 or 30 years because of their horrific war. We have opportunities in Africa and in Indonesia and so forth, which you all understand very well. But I think this is the truth right now, and we better get ourselves together so that we win in the competition around strategic platforms. I don't want to be using Chinese operating systems to do my communications. I just don't. I don't trust them.
Thank you, Eric. You've powerfully encapsulated your thesis in a very succinct and concise form. We do have two questioners. We're running up against time, but I'm going to exercise a degree of prerogative here and go just a couple of minutes over. Eric, if you can stay online for 3 or 4 more minutes. I'd ask the two questioners lined up, and only two, briefly state your affiliation and a very concise question, please, gentlemen, and then over to Eric. First question.
Many thanks, Mike. Alan Duffy from Swinburne University. Dr. Schmidt, you raised the opportunity that drones present, where quantity really has a quality all of its own. Are we not risking the challenge by our adversaries owning the largest drone fleet, the Chinese companies in particular, where we are attacking them head on exactly where they are strongest? And I acknowledge the utility and the vision for that as a future, but does that not run a risk that we are playing ourselves off against their strength?
Thank you.
Alan, that's very well said. And the fact of the matter is that 90% of the commercially available consumer drones are built in China, in DJI and others. That does not, however, mean that there are not opportunities to build very powerful national security drones. And I'm now aware of literally 100 startups related to the Ukraine challenge, which are trying different approaches. As you know, in combat, the first thing you do is you block GPS. It's the first thing that anybody does. I read with some interest, Qantas reported that one of their airplanes was, in fact, GPS was jammed. And thank goodness there was no harm to that. So there's something going on with GPS. So the military drones are going to be quite different from the DJI drones, carry heavier payloads. What I believe will happen is eventually there will be a call for the equivalent of a gigafactory for drones. We're just going to need a lot of them and built in the West with Western components.
Thank you. And one final question, following the example set by the first question, a very short, sharp, succinct question. Thank you, sir.
So I'm Michael Whitbrook from the University of Auckland and from Transaxon, a brain-computer interface company. We're currently in a time when we're clearly moving from natural and organizational intelligence as the way we run the world to a combination of natural, artificial, and organizational intelligence. And my question is, are we already past the offset X age, and how long is kind of offset X thinking sustainable in a world where artificial intelligence is deeply integrated everywhere, and is the sort of competition you're talking about, these bipolar or multipolar competitions amongst humans, even sustainable for even 5 years, let alone 30?
Thank you. And Eric, this will be an opportunity for you to provide some final concluding observations as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mike. I think that the first place, Offset X is designed to be powered by AI. Essentially, all of the automation, all of the autonomy, all of the navigation is AI enabled. And one of the things that we say very clearly is that we want automatic weapons, but we want the humans to make the decision to deploy them. So we're very clear where the boundary is. And I think that for at least 10, maybe 20 years, it's going to be very important that any system that uses AI have a human not only in the loop, but watching what it's doing. Because as you know, the current systems, whether they're diffusion models or transformer models, tend to make mistakes, they tend to hallucinate and so forth and so on. I will tell you that I've never seen the gains that we've seen in technology. I've been doing this in one form or another for 50 years. I've never seen the gains and speed of what we're seeing with the large language models. Now, my industry has gone insane. It also means that the rest of the world is going insane too. So not only are we all going to invent this AI future, but so are the Chinese. We can't prevent it. We can't just hold it to the equivalent of Los Alamos and hold it to ourselves for a few years for advantage. So we're in a race. And I'd say too, just to wrap up for the Sydney dialogues, I think the most important thing to understand is that China is a new kind of competitor. They are a partner in the sense that we can rely on them for some things, but they're a competitor in others. Notice I didn't say enemy. If you look at Russia, Russia is becoming legitimate as an enemy to the West with respect to their illegal activity in Ukraine. And so there's a good test bed for us to prove that this new innovation model can actually help hold back the old model. And I think that we need to sort of seriously understand that here's a real land war that's going on in front of us. How would our systems, let's use you as Australians, how would your systems hold up under the kind of attack that the Russians have done? Let's hope that you conclude well. Now let's do the same analysis for China's strategy, which is much more organized around hypersonics and drones and autonomy, and you might be not as happy with yourself. That should spur action. I'm very happy to help you guys and work on this. I care a lot about it, and I really, really am thankful that you invited me. And please have a good morning. It's evening here in New York, but I look forward to being there soon.
Well, Eric, we've gone a few minutes over, but that was an absolutely scintillatingly fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, both the deep thought you've given the issues, but also your passion for them and your commitment to public service really came through in your remarks. Colleagues in the audience, if we can extend our thanks to Eric.
Thank you all.